talk briefly to you about this covenant, probably one of the most important and famous of the covenants in the Old Testament. Certainly in the eyes of the Jewish people, the most important covenant of all, the covenant that God makes with Abraham, their father, the person that they consider to be their ancestor in faith. And yet it's an interesting covenant, isn't it? Usually the word covenant is reserved for something that would be like a very sacred contract. And like most contracts that we would be familiar with, there are obligations on both sides. The two people or the two groups that are entering into a contract make promises. If you do this, I promise to do that. And it's usually if it's worked out well, and certainly if it's worked out by a lawyer, whether for well or for ill, there's lots of fine print, and there's lots of special words that only lawyers can understand. Covenants with God are pretty plain and open. God doesn't hire a team of lawyers to put on a lot of fine print. God speaks very clearly so that the people he's talking to can understand. But this is an unusual contract, is it not? This is my covenant with you, God says. You will become the father of a host of nations. I am making you the father of a host of nations. I will render you exceedingly fertile. I will make nations of you, and kings shall stem from you. And I will maintain my covenant with you and your descendants throughout the ages. So you say, okay, well that lines up everything that God is going to do. What is Abraham supposed to do? I mean, if this is a covenant instead of a promissory note, if this has obligations on both sides, what are the obligations? Now, if God said to Abraham, you are going to be the father of a host of nations, and you're going to be extremely fertile and be the father of a host of nations, literally, then you'd say Abraham has got a lot of sleepless nights ahead of him. It's hard to see that poor Abraham, and who in his old age with his wife were only able to produce one son through a miracle, that if this were literally expected of Abraham that he be fertile and multiply himself, he really didn't keep his end of the bargain up. Even that takes a certain amount of understanding. So what is required of Abraham? And what's required of his descendants in this contract with God, the solemn and sacred promise that is entered into with God? It seems so one-sided. God is going to do everything, and Abraham and his descendants have to do what? Well, as we look not only through the Old Testament, but we look through the New Testament, there is nowhere that Abraham is listed as a failure. Certainly not a failure in the human sense, and certainly never listed as someone who did not keep his end of the bargain with God. But if that's the case, then we look to the Scriptures and to the New Testament as well as to the Old Testament. You can go to the epistles of St. Paul and you'll see it. You know, why it is credited to Abraham as somebody who, perhaps more than anyone else, kept his contract with God. His end of the bargain was that he believed that God would do what he would do. Remember, it is accounted on Abraham's part, it is put to his credit that he believed that what God said he would do, he would do. Abraham didn't see great nations in his lifetime. He was lucky he saw one son and felt very blessed that he saw one son. But Abraham died believing that God would fulfill that promise eventually, to bring forth from his offspring a great nation. And you say to yourself, well, that's a pretty good bargain. All you got to do is believe in the person who's... Can you imagine entering into a contract with someone where somebody says, I promise to build you a house, and all you have to do is believe that I'm going to build it. And you say, hey, you got me. You know, I can do that much. It's not going to cost me much. I just have to believe. And yet it is a difficult bargain to uphold. Because many of the children of Abraham did not believe that God was going to fulfill his promise. They began to doubt. They began to be the people who abandoned their faith in the God of Abraham and chose other idols. They began to live another lifestyle from the one that God had proposed for them. Many people stopped believing. The people in the desert who were being led to a land flowing with milk and honey by Moses, many of them stopped believing, didn't they? Remember the terrible situation at Meribah, where many of them were destroyed precisely because they gave up. They were not children of Abraham because they no longer held up their end of this sacred bargain with God. They no longer believed that he would do what he said. That's Abraham's great accomplishment. And throughout the ages, he is recognized as our father in faith because he never doubted that the Lord would do what he promised. And in that end, he upheld the contract with God. And the contract extends to you and to me. Each and every one of us are part of that sacred contract with God. Each and every day we reaffirm our belief that God in Christ Jesus will uphold all of the promises that he had made. Then we are truly children of Abraham because we believe that God, who is all-powerful, will never go against the word that he has solemnly given throughout the ages to Abraham and to his descendants.